I still remember the day my children, Clara and Samuel, told me they wouldn't be coming to see me during that first Christmas after my ex-wife Patricia and I finalized our divorce. At the time, I brushed it off as a result of the tension lingering from the separation, reassuring myself that they'd come around once everyone had cooled off. But life has a way of crushing illusions when you least expect it. Instead of a phone call or a last-minute knock at my door, I got silence. An endless, gaping silence that confirmed something I never thought possible. My kids had chosen their mother over me. They had severed ties and moved on, pinning their hopes and loyalties on the shiny new life she had built with her wealthy new husband. I was the father who had spent years reading them bedtime stories, only to be shut out completely. I never saw it coming. So how did we get to that point? That's a question I've spent countless sleepless nights asking myself. We were a typical suburban family once, 2 kids, a dog named Lucky, and a well-maintained lawn. I was working as an accountant, Patricia was a high school English teacher, and the kids spent their time bouncing between soccer practices, music lessons, and weekend birthday parties. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, something had started rotting away. It turned out Patricia had grown bored with our life and even bored with me. She'd fallen for a client at the private tutoring sessions she did to earn extra income. He was charismatic, successful, and unbelievably wealthy. By the time I found out about the affair, she had already set the stage for our downfall. She seemed so certain that her new path was worth destroying our family for. I won't forget the day I confronted her in our living room. She didn't even bother denying it. She merely sighed, looked me straight in the eyes, and told me she deserved more than the half-baked existence I was giving her. I might have shouted, I can't remember. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the glass of water I'd been holding. Then came the arguments, the ones that rattled the walls and scarred the children. I tried to salvage our marriage. I proposed therapy, time off from work, maybe a rekindling trip to the very place we had honeymooned. Nothing swayed her. Patricia was already mentally packed, destined for a world where my modest income as an accountant paled in comparison to the zeros in that man's bank account. And so, we got the lawyers involved, we divided up our lives, and we signed those dreaded divorce papers. Together. Initially, I thought the kids would stay neutral, or at least give me the benefit of the doubt. Clara was 16 and Samuel was 14 at the time, old enough to have opinions, but still too young to fully grasp adult complexities. For a while, I tried to shield them from the ugliness of it all, but Patricia didn't do the same. She blamed me for everything, painting me as the unambitious, complacent husband who couldn't keep up with her dreams. She regaled them with stories of her new partner's successful business ventures, the exotic places he'd taken her, the expensive gifts he showered on both her and them. When I tried to explain my side, they shrugged, uninterested. In their eyes, their mother had found something better, and I was just the guy who had failed to deliver. I never thought my own children would view me that way, ever. The divorce settlement was relatively straightforward. I let Patricia keep the house because I couldn't bear the suffocating memories that clung to every corner. I moved into a small apartment near my workplace. At first, Clara and Samuel visited on weekends. They were polite but distant, as though I were an old acquaintance rather than their father. Then Patricia's new husband, Richard, swept in like a fairy godfather, offering them lucrative part-time positions at his tech company. Overnight, my children were rubbing elbows with CEOs and living in a world where private jets were a weekend treat. They had a taste of money, power, and high society. My phone calls to them became less frequent. Sometimes Clara would answer, sometimes she wouldn't. Samuel always seemed too busy. Gradually, the visits stopped entirely. I tried to stay patient, but deep down, I knew I was losing them for good, forevermore. I didn't realize how far they drifted until I got wind of Clara's wedding through a distant relative. By then, she was in her early 20s, working full-time at Richard's firm, and enjoying a lifestyle I could never compete with. She had the perfect dress, the perfect venue, and the perfect guest list, one that did not include her biological father. The rejection cut deeper than I imagined it would. When I confronted her over the phone, she told me it was a family affair and that I would make things awkward. After that, I stopped calling altogether. I didn't want to beg for scraps of their attention, nor did I want to humiliate myself by forcing my presence where it was obviously unwelcome. A year later, I heard that Samuel got married too. also without a single word of invitation to me. It felt like a final, irrevocable disownment and heartbreak. They haven't spoken to me in 8 years now. You might wonder why I didn't try harder, why I didn't push back or fight for my parental rights. Truth is, I did, for a while. But there comes a point when you realize you can't force love or respect. If your own children look at you like an unwanted intruder, you can only stand so many rejections before you close the door yourself. I won't deny that I fell into a depression. I went from being a father of 2 to a solitary man with no immediate family. Memories of them tugged at me constantly, mocking me with each passing day. When I saw families at the mall or fathers playing catch in the park, I felt a stab of envy so deep it almost made me physically ill. But you can't cry about it forever, can you? I refused, though, so I rebuilt myself one piece at a time. I focused on my career, took on extra certifications, and eventually landed a better position at a mid-sized financial firm. I made decent money, managed to move into a nicer condo, and even started traveling a bit. With each passing year, I inched further away from the broken man I used to be. I found new hobbies, gardening, cooking elaborate meals for myself, and occasionally volunteering at a local charity. Did I think about them? Of course. But I learned to compartmentalize, storing the heartbreak in a sealed mental box labeled "Do Not Open." Over time, I perfected the art of functioning without hope of reconciliation. I told myself I was better off without their pity or half-hearted relationships. If they wanted me out of their lives so badly, I would respect their choice, or at least pretend to. I had to, but fate has a dark sense of humor. A month ago, I received an email from an unknown sender. At first, I assumed it was spam until I recognized the name, Samuel. He wrote that Richard's company was in financial trouble, some scandal involving embezzlement. Their mother was beside herself. They didn't know what to do. He asked if I could use my accounting expertise to help them figure out what was going on. He claimed he was reaching out because he trusted me more than he ever trusted Richard. If he hoped I would jump at the chance to fix their problems, he was mistaken. I read that email 3 times, letting my anger simmer. 8 years of silence, and now they came to me, not out of love or remorse, but purely out of desperation. Did they think I was some convenient safety net they could exploit? Not anymore. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stewed in my resentment, recalling every unanswered call, every missed holiday, every wedding invitation that never arrived. They wanted me now? Because their golden meal ticket was cracking under legal scrutiny? I felt a spark ignite, a vindictive urge I didn't know I still possessed. For years, I tried to bury my bitterness. I'd convinced myself that moving on was the healthiest option. But sometimes, justice demands a different approach. Let them squirm. Let them face the consequences of turning their backs on me. Maybe that was wrong, morally questionable at best, but it felt good to consider. I wasn't the naive father desperate for a crumb of their affection anymore. I was a man who had rebuilt his life from the ashes they left behind. My phone pinged again a few days later, another email, this time from Clara, echoing Samuel's pleas. I simply smiled in rage. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I opened Clara's email and read her frantic words. She wrote about a federal investigation looming over Richard's company, how the employees' accounts were frozen, how her own bank assets might be seized if the scandal pointed to widespread financial misconduct. She admitted she was scared, that she didn't trust Richard's legal team. She didn't say she was sorry for cutting me out of her life. There was no apology anywhere in that email, just fear and desperation, and a plea for help. In that moment, I realized that all those fatherly instincts I'd tried so hard to kill off weren't entirely dead. A tiny voice in my head whispered that my children needed me, even if they had made me an outcast. But then another voice, colder and sharper, reminded me of the years of betrayal and silence. I clenched my fists. I wrote back a single sentence. I'll think about it. Then I busied myself with work, half expecting them to flood my inbox with more pleas. But days passed, and I heard nothing. Perhaps they were waiting for me to come to a decision. Perhaps they were too proud to beg further. I imagined Patricia pacing in her lavish living room, anxious for any sign of salvation. I pictured Richard, once so confident and smug, now cornered by allegations he couldn't shrug off. And my children, my own flesh and blood, caught in the crossfire. A part of me wanted to swoop in and save them, to prove I was the better person. But another part, the one still tasting the bitterness of abandonment, craved retribution. Why should I rescue them when they'd been so eager to cast me aside? I was torn, and I hated myself for it. I paced for hours. Ultimately, I decided to investigate. Not to save them, exactly, but to see what kind of trouble they were in. Using my professional networks, I accessed public records and rumors swirling around Richard's enterprise. The man had been funneling money through shell companies, forging invoices and inflating expenses to hide massive profits. It was only a matter of time before the authorities closed in. Clara and Samuel, as employees with signatory roles, could be implicated. The scale of the fraud was staggering, and if found guilty, Richard faced serious prison time. My children's assets and freedoms dangled on a precarious edge. As I delved deeper, I wrestled with my conscience. Did I want to help them find a loophole, or did I want to hand them over to the wolves? A cunning plan began to form in my mind, one that would satisfy my lingering thirst for justice and revenge. I arranged a meeting with Clara and Samuel under the guise of discussing a strategy. They suggested a fancy restaurant in the city, but I insisted on a quiet cafe near my office, neutral ground. When they walked in, I almost didn't recognize them. Designer suits, expensive watches, an air of entitlement that made my stomach churn. They offered awkward hugs and forced smiles, as though we were estranged coworkers rather than family. Over lattes, they laid out the documents, pointing to ledger discrepancies and bank statements. Clara's voice trembled as she confessed her fear of going to prison. Samuel kept tapping his foot under the table, the tension visible in his clenched jaw. Still, not once did they say, "Dad, we're sorry." Instead, they spoke as if I was an outsourced expert, someone they could hire for damage control. My resentment grew with every syllable they uttered. I felt numb. I told them I'd look into possible solutions. Privately, I resolved to do so in a way that would not only expose Richard, but leave my children questioning the loyalties they'd chosen. I spent weeks poring over the data. Yes, I could have arranged a settlement or found a legal loophole to minimize the fallout, but something in me refused to let them off that easily. Instead, I gathered proof. Emails linking Richard's fraudulent transactions directly to his personal accounts, recordings of phone calls where he instructed staff to manipulate financial statements. As for Clara and Samuel, I ensured their involvement looked minimal while highlighting Richard's manipulative tactics. I wanted them to see the full scope of his betrayal, to realize that the man they idolized was the very one who might ruin their lives. If they learned a lesson about blind loyalty, so be it. I felt no mercy. Ever. On the day I handed over my findings, I could see the color drain from their faces. Clara's eyes filled with tears when she realized just how deep Richard's corruption ran. Samuel's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. I told them they had a choice: cooperate with investigators and reveal Richard's tactics, or face possible charges themselves. They looked at me like frightened children again, searching for reassurance. But I couldn't summon any paternal comfort. Instead, I told them the truth. If they wanted to save themselves, they needed to cut ties with their mother's husband. They needed to testify if necessary. As for me, I'd provide the documents to the authorities, ensuring that Richard took the brunt of the fall. Whether Clara or Samuel wanted to maintain contact with me afterward was up to them. I offered no solace. Ever. They did cooperate to an extent. Within weeks, Richard was indicted, his assets frozen, and the media had a field day unraveling his decade-long empire of lies. I later learned that Patricia's lavish lifestyle crumbled practically overnight. The house, the cars, the jewels, all seized. My kids were questioned, but ultimately released without charges, thanks to the evidence I'd provided showing they were pawns, not co-conspirators. Once the dust settled, Clara called me. I expected gratitude, but all I heard was devastation. She said Patricia blamed me for destroying their lives, that I had acted out of spite. Then she broke down crying, asking if I could ever forgive them. I stood there, phone in hand, my heart pounding. For a moment, I felt a pang of the old paternal love, but it was overshadowed by the memory of 8 silent years. I let her cry. I offered no comfort again. You might judge me for that, but betrayal changes a person. For years, I was nothing more than a ghost in their lives, overshadowed by wealth and a mother's manipulations. Did I want revenge? Yes, and I got it. Richard was behind bars, Patricia lost her kingdom, and my children were forced to confront their own moral failures. Some might say I was cruel not to embrace them the moment they came back. But forgiveness isn't an obligation. It's a privilege given to those who've earned it. Clara and Samuel made their bed when they chose their mother's money over my love. They only returned when their new world collapsed. I refused to be a backup plan. I refused to let them think they could treat me as disposable. Sometimes you have to protect your heart, even from your own flesh and blood. That was my reality. I slept soundly afterward. Months passed. I occasionally received voicemails from Clara or Samuel, but they never seemed sure what to say. Patricia apparently filed for bankruptcy. Richard remained in custody, awaiting trial. The media circus moved on to other scandals, leaving my family in a quiet ruin. Sometimes I wondered if I should reach out, extend an olive branch. But then I'd remember the holidays spent alone, the empty mailbox that should have been stuffed with wedding invitations, the birthdays they never cared to celebrate with me. A man can only endure so much before his heart becomes a fortified fortress. I had no interest in letting them tear down my walls again. Maybe one day they'll earn my trust back, but it won't be through hollow apologies or convenient loyalty. It'll take genuine effort and remorse. Until then, I remain resolute in my decision. I owe them nothing. My pride is unwavering. So here I stand, 8 years after being exiled from my own children's lives, with the knowledge that I stayed true to myself. In the end, we make our choices, and we must live with the consequences. My kids chose their mother's money, and I chose my self-respect. Do I regret it? Sometimes. Late at night, when the house is silent and my mind wanders, I think about what might have been if things had gone differently. But regret is a corrosive emotion, and I refuse to let it dominate my life. I have no illusions that we'll ever be a happy family again. That bridge was burned long ago by their own hands as much as mine. Still, I continue on, carving out a life that doesn't revolve around their approval. Maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. No one can take your dignity unless you let them. Never.